great pleasure to announce Distinguished Professor, University Professor Paul Kirschner from the Open University of the Netherlands. He's Educational Professor for Educational Psychology. I have some notes from Paul. I mean, you also see it on the website. He has been an internationally recognized expert on the field of educational psychology and instructional design. He has what we all want to have. He has on Google Scholar an article with 3,500 citations. So Paul is really a great person, a great mind of our times. He has been president of the International Society for Learning Science in the past. He is chief editor of the Journal of Computers, JCAL Journal. And let me add a personal note, because I could continue like this over 10 minutes and then we miss the important words from Paul. Having been a little PhD at the Open University, Paul is a great academic father that shapes the Open University and really drives us to high quality standards. That starts when you come into the Open University. You have a talk with Paul somehow in the first week where he talks to you and you don't know what and why about, and he's not your supervisor or whatever, but he talks to you then over, I don't know, music, Italian food or other things. But it continues over that trajectory that he also talks about with you about your content, about the stuff you are doing, and he will also blog about it and tweet about it if he disagrees with stuff you're doing. So, Paul is a great person for great discussions, and I hope he will challenge you guys in the LAK community now in his keynote about learning analytics, Utopia and Dystopia, so that you kind of experience what does it mean to be a PhD at our university. Paul.
Oh, okay, thank you. What wasn't said is that Hendrik is now special issues editor of the Journal of Computer Assisted Learning. So if anybody has any ideas for great special issues, just get in touch with him, and I'll have some news at the end of this conference, this session also about that. Yes? Okay. I'll try to start mine. Let me close this. Don't save. Hopefully this is mine. Okay. We'll get to why the name of this is Utopia and Dystopia in a couple of minutes. Let me see. Before I begin, I'd like to say a word of thanks. Of course, I'd like to thank the conference and the conference organizers for inviting me to present this keynote. But I'd really like to especially thank Grace Lynch, along with her, of course, from the Netherlands, giving a virtual bouquet of Dutch tulips. In England, I couldn't bring a real bouquet of Dutch tulips because they would have arrested me and thrown me in jail and things like that. For all of her careful and caring work. I'd also like to thank the organizers for kind of challenging me to go in depth into a field in which I was busy with kind of like on the side, but never really in depth. And this is kind of a little bit out of my comfort zone in a certain way. And that was really nice to be forced to do that. So don't stay in your comfort zone. Normally at this moment I'd ask everyone to not use their laptops and telephones, but I think that request would be considered very blasphemous in this environment. In any event, I'd ask you to please turn off the sound so that it doesn't ring while I'm doing it. And now we can proceed further. Just to make sure that you can adjust your expectations, this is not what the keynote's not about. Okay? The first three were discussed in more or less by Mireille yesterday morning. I didn't know that would be the case, but that's kind of good. I'm not talking about things like commercial interests, and I'm not even going to really be talking about technology and things like that. I think the motto of this session would be what Bill Clinton said. He said it's about the economy, stupid, or it's about the economy people. Here it's the learning people. Mireille's presentation yesterday was cartoon-driven, Mine is primarily image-driven, okay? Okay, we're here in Edinburgh. While Charles Dickens was here in Edinburgh, he came across a gravestone that he would render immortal. In Canongate Kirkyard, it's about 2 kilometers from here in the city on the Royal Mile. I was there yesterday. He came across a gravestone of one Ebenezer Lennox Scroggie. The epitaph listed his profession as being a meal man, probably someone in with grain and things like that, but he misinterpreted and he thought it was a mean man. And in a nation noted for its frugality, Dickens thought this was really hard for Scroggie to bear until eternity, such a terrible thing to eternity. And so text analysis here went wrong, but A Christmas Carol was born. A little bit of history, kind of like Tim O'Shea did yesterday. But what I see in the world of learning analytics is more like A Tale of Two Cities, which was inspired by Thomas Carlyle, an Ecclefechan-born historian. And Dickens opens A Tale of Two Cities with the following shortened quote. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. And in that respect, that's kind of expresses what I sometimes feel about learning analytics. This thought might best be expressed by a clip from one of my favorite television series from the last time, along with Mr. Robot. And as a preface to that, it's a clip from Black Mirror. Black Mirror is a British television anthology that features dark and speculative fiction which examine modern society, particularly with regard to the unanticipated consequences of new technologies. That's what I'll be talking about later. In this episode, Martha and Ash, a young couple, move to a remote house in the countryside. Ash is a social media addict and compulsively checks his phone for updates on his social network pages, probably not unlike many people here. The day after moving into the house, Ash is killed returning the hired van, probably texting while driving. I have a complete PowerPoint on that. Martha accesses a new online services that lets people stay in touch with the deceased. By using all of his past online communications and social media profiles, a new Ash is created and virtually exists. And this is it. A little excerpt of it. That's Ash. And Martha.
Successful testing of intelligent synthetic flesh aimed at getting multiple amputees back on their feet has been hailed as a major breakthrough. Elsewhere.
Ash! Ash! Can you take those? I snossed in yours, is that okay?
Yeah. What?
Palms, burning palms.
Shit. Sorry. Bye-bye.
Sweetheart, nothing's happened. You're just working yourself up, imagining the worst possible thing, and it's just... He's probably stuck somewhere with no reception. I can sign you up to something that helps. It helped me. It will let you speak to him. I know he's dead, but it wouldn't work if he wasn't. And don't worry, it's not some crazy spiritual thing. He was a heavy user. He'd be perfect.
Please, shut up.
I mean, it's still in beta, but I've got an invite.
Please, shut up.
You won't even have to do anything. I'll just... Shut up!
what it is. I don't want it. It's obscene to use his name. His name, for God's sake. It hurts. You know it hurts.
Which is why I signed you up.
What is it? What is it? It's just...
You click the link and you talk to it.
You talk to it?
You type messages in, like an email, and then it talks back to you just like he would.
He is dead.
It's software. It mimics him. You give it someone's name. It goes back and reads through all the things they've ever said online, their Facebook updates, their tweets, anything public. I just gave it Ash's name. The system did the rest. It's so clever.
Well, it's sick. It's sick.
Just say hello to it. If you like it, you then give it access to his private emails. The more it has, the more it's him.
It won't be...
No, it's not. But it helps.
I won't give you a spoiler. I'd say it's going to be on Netflix season 3. Each season only has up till now, three programs. I find it really interesting. As you can see, is this utopian or dystopian? In any event, it makes use of something like learning analytics, and it just goes further and further and further. I won't give you any, I won't make a spoiler, but I say watch it. Before I begin, really begin, I'd like to have a couple of obligatory slides out of the way. Okay? Yes, there's an ever-increasing amount of data. We're already up to zettabytes, and we're past exabytes, and it's just really incredible. So, but that's not what I'm talking about. Yes, there's a hype cycle that learning analytics might be riding on. We see it on top of the hype at this moment. But I feel that a recent tweet by my good friend Dave Wiley might put this into a little better perspective. Maybe get it off of the ride on the hype cycle, as I'm fairly anti-hype. And yes, there's Moore's Law, and it appears to be holding for a heck of a lot of things. Actually, the number of submissions to this conference would have been a suitable slide for this, but I just saw it yesterday and couldn't download it. So now down to business. Why am I here as a non-learning analytics person? When Caroline Rosé contacted me as to whether I'd consider giving a keynote here, I asked her what she expected of me as the keynote speaker. And she said I would have 2 tasks. The first task was shake it up. In other words, be your controversial self. And the second is break it down. Explain what learning is and learning sciences are, and why it's important for learning analytics. And as someone with the motto, I'd rather be infamous than famous, I of course accepted the challenge from Carolyn. Okay, let's begin. I'll break down the 2 different aspects. The first, what's learning? If I Google the words definition and learning, I get at the moment 614 million results. A month ago, when I tweaked this, there were like 570 million. So that means in the last month, there are 45 million new pages on learning and what learning is. With that many hits, of course, I chose the simplest one, that was Wikipedia, which states the following. Learning is the act of acquiring new or modifying and reinforcing existing knowledge behaviors, skills, values, or preferences, and may involve synthesizing different types of information. It does not happen all at once, but builds upon and is shaped by previous knowledge. So that, to that end, learning may be viewed as a process rather than a collection of factual and procedural knowledge. Learning produces changes in the organism, and the changes produced are relatively permanent. But I tend myself to use a much simpler definition, namely a permanent change in one's long-term memory. That was in the 3,500 times cited article that I wrote with John Sweller and Dick Clark. But if you want to get a bit technical, and don't worry, I'm not going into neuroscience and neuropsychology. It's more like this. Different parts of the brain are specialized for the storage of memories. Short-term memories seem to be located in the prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes. That's areas 6 and 7. Long-term memories seem to involve both subcortical and cortical structures. Semantic and episodic memories seem to be located in the frontal area and the temporal lobes of the cortex. And procedural memories are located in the cerebellum and the motor cortex. The hippocampus, that's area 4, seems especially important in the consolidation of semantic, episodic, and procedural memories. Finally, emotional memories are dependent on the amygdala. So maybe my definition of it's just a change in long-term memory isn't that simple at all if we really look at it. The second is, let's call it preface to this, is what are the learning sciences? As I myself wrote in the original Wikipedia lemma for learning sciences is an interdisciplinary field that works to further scientific understanding of learning, as well as to engage in the design and implementation of learning innovations and the improvement of instructional methodologies. Research in the learning sciences traditionally focuses on cognitive psychological, social psychological, and cultural psychological foundations of human learning, as well as on the design of learning environments. Major contributing fields include cognitive science, computer science, educational psychology, anthropology, applied linguistics, and I can add now neuroscience, neuroeducation, and all different types of things to it. Note here that I speak of the learning sciences as a plural. It's about how a number of often very different and divergent fields contribute to the understanding of how people learn. Finally, what's learning analytics? In 2007, EDUCAUSE paper, John Campbell and Diana Oblinger spoke of learning analytics, not of learning analytics, but of academic analytics, which they considered to be an engine to make decisions or guide actions, and consisted of 5 steps. Capturing, which is, I don't have to explain it to you. Rebecca Ferguson discussed that really well in 2012. Reporting, but I would prefer to call that querying, where you look at the data and you ask it questions. Predicting, which is to try to identify the predictors of student success. Acting, in which instructors act on the information, and I would like to add to that instructors, I could call it the system. In another thing that I've written, I call that the system, and the system could be electronic, it could be persons as instructors or tutors. That's the system outside of it, where the control is often moves from the system to the person. And finally, refining. So after you've gathered and processed and evaluated it, it's used in a cyclical model going back to the beginning. According to George Siemens, learning analytics is the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs. In learning analytics, one collects and assesses data so as to predict educational outcomes with the goal of tailoring education. This was apparently expanded in 2013 to include all of this. According to Rebecca and Manika, learning analytics is the application of big data and predictive analytics in educational settings. So far, so good. The question might now arise from what do the learning sciences have to do with learning analytics and vice versa? And my answer to that would be just about everything. As Simon Knight, Alyssa Wise, Goldes Arastapour, Dave William Schaefer, Simon Buckingham Shum and I wrote in an ISLS workshop in 2014, learning analytics sits at the intersection of the learning sciences and computational data capture and analysis. Analytics should be grounded in the existing literature with a view to data geology or archaeology over mining. I'll get back to this later. And now, after having broken it down a bit, it's time to shake it up maybe with a couple of dystopian futures. What these definitions tell me is that what practitioners are actually doing is more a case of educational analytics, much more than learning analytics, because learning and education are two completely different things. Learning, as stated, is that permanent change in long-term memory that happens within the learner, him or herself. But education as a noun is the system which has been set up for a systematic instruction, especially at a school or a university. As a verb, it is the action or process of teaching someone, especially in a school, college, or university. In other words, it aims for a certain type of learning, namely formal learning in a certain environment, but that's definitely not the same as learning. There's just an aside here, but I think it's very important, because if we look at most of the major uses of learning analytics at the moment, it's more academic or institutional analytics and not very much about learning. That's the second thing I'll probably be shot for at a certain point in time. When I took a closer look at George Siemens's model, I saw that the purposes of learning analytics were very clear. That's in the red circle there. You'll notice that learning is in fourth place. Strange. And then I looked at the data team, strange, data team, and I noticed that someone was severely missing from this team, and I wonder who that might be, he said. And yes, you're right, it's the learning scientist. And why is this such a problem? Going back to Alyssa and Dave Williamson Schaefer, they emphasize the role of theory in the analysis of large-scale data. David sometimes refers to this as the difference, and this is in my words, between digging and mining. Mining companies don't just dig. They don't just go somewhere where the machines start digging or drilling and hope that they find something. And for some of the older people here, the company isn't like Jed Clampett of the Beverly Hillbillies, who luckily found black gold Texas tea while walking around and shooting. If you don't, go to YouTube and listen to the opening of the Beverly Hillbillies. These companies make use of knowledge and theories relating to geology, tectonics, all of those types of things, and then gather and analyze specific data about a certain piece of land, and then make a well-informed prediction or a well-educated guess as to whether what they're looking for can actually be found where they're looking. For this reason, the learning scientist is the crucial missing factor, because she or he operates on the basis of theory, and theory has several very important functions. You can see them here. I learned from John Sweller, who once wrote a very famous article about PowerPoint called "No Damn Power, No Damn Point," that the last thing you should do when you're presenting is read your slides, because it's called the redundancy effect. I'm asking you to semantically process the information both while reading it and listening to it. That causes a problem in your short-term memory, in your working memory. And so I won't say it, but I'll talk around it. But in any event, you can see what's here, and what's there is very important is that it looks first at what variables it should include. It includes what might confound that data, what you should look at. Gives you a way of interpreting what you found, how to make things actionable, how to intervene, yeah? And it gives you the ability to generalize what you found, possibly generalize what you found, to other learning environments, contexts, and population. And that's not to say that it's a one-way street. Exploratory data analysis of large collection of data is really, really good. It allows one in the true Baconian sense. Now, Alyssa and David compared this to the true 18th and 19th century antiquarians who collected and filled rarity cabinets, and then based upon that, thought, how did that happen? And to be a little bit more up to date on this, yesterday what Tim O'Shea, who I've been following for years, is kind of like a hero to me, who spoke about James Hutton here in Edinburgh, who did the exact same thing. He was a farmer who, farming the field for 15, 20 years, came about this idea of tectonics and is kind of the father of modern geology. So there's nothing wrong with using that to discover patterns and associations across modalities, like coordinating gaze and talks over time, for example, revisiting previously studied material, or even the microgenetic level, how a teacher uses analytics to monitor and support student learning activities. But if you look at it that way, then it's exploratory. And any good learning scientist or educational psychologist or cognitive psychologist knows that from exploratory research, you really can't draw any good causal conclusions as to how to intervene and what you should do. You get ideas about what relates to what. And then if you have this theory behind it, or you develop this theory, you might think of, do they really have something to do with each other, or is something else possibly causing that? Without this, we're just digging. This is my granddaughter Elsa, who last week was just digging. Not looking for much in general, but just digging. And as Rebecca Ferguson wrote in 2012, the first challenge of the field is to build strong connections with the learning sciences. Maybe that's why I was invited. Yeah? People who come from the United States know that this was from 1988 or something, 1992, when Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers, decided to run for president and have this as a bumper sticker, unencumbered by the thought process. It's not only the case in US elections. If you look at this one, what's going on at the moment, you really understand what I'm talking about if I'm talking about not unencumbered by the thought process. But I call learning analytics as highly data-rich but theory-poor. So the second dystopian future deals with this theory-free or theory-poor learning analytics. And thus, such approaches make use of what there is and not what's needed. And thus, you're not sure about what you find are very important variables. It kind of reminds me about the joke about the drunkard. Sometimes people talk about the engineer that might fit better in this group, who lost her or his car keys and is searching for them under a street lamp. For those who don't know it, it goes like this. A police officer sees a drunken man intently searching the ground near a lamppost and asks him the goal of his quest. The inebriate replies that he's looking for his car keys, and the officer helps him for a few minutes without success. Then he asks whether the man is certain that he dropped the keys near the lamppost. No, is the reply. I lost the keys somewhere across the street. Then why look here? Asked the surprised and irritated police officer. The answer of the intoxicated man is, the light here is much better. This is known as the street light effect. It's a type of observational bias where people only look for whatever they're searching for by looking where it is easiest to look. In certain respects, many of us practicing learning analytics at the moment are like the drunk or the engineer. We have lots and lots and lots of data and are looking there to find answers to learning problems or to facilitate learning. But we're looking at the data we have and not the data we need. That was made very clear yesterday by Mireille, who I hope I'm citing correctly, who said in her keynote yesterday that what we don't or can't capture is not part of what is analyzed, and she was talking about large-scale text, verbal, things like that. So what we don't or can't capture is not part of what is analyzed, and the problem here is clear. Without proper learning theory frameworks, we might be looking at the wrong things. The third dystopia. Many learning analytics researchers, possibly due to their lack of background in the learning sciences or due to not having that learning scientist in their teams, make use of variables that are neither reliable nor valid. A typical example is all of the learning analytics research which makes use of learning styles, which is pure hogwash. If I wasn't in this audience, I'd think of another word or use another word to describe it. Motivation, which is influenced by success and failure and not the other way around. There's been a lot of recent research showing that if you're good, if you're successful, you're motivated. But motivation in no way guarantees or leads to success. And engagement, which I heard a lot of yesterday, which is positively experienced, that's great, but it's time and again been shown to have little or no effect on learning. Sorry, all of you lovers of Ryan and Daisy and Ryan. One particularly poorly informed group of researchers, I will name no names, even went so far as to hail the value of, I quote, in particular learning styles such as self-regulated learning. Not only do these learning analytics researchers use the learning styles myth as an important part of their model, they also appear to have no idea that self-regulated learning is a metacognitive process and not a style of learning. Self-regulation is not a mental ability or an academic performance skill, rather it is the self-directive process by which learners transform their mental abilities into academic skills. And that's Zimmerman, the father of that concept. The fourth dystopia. It appears that many people, hold on, let me just take a drink. Many people, learning analytics researchers included, have a problem with the difference between causal relationship and a correlational relationship. For those of you in the audience who don't know the difference, here it is. A correlation is a measure or degree of relationship between two variables. A set of data can be positively correlated, negatively correlated, or not correlated at all. As one set of variables increases, the other set tends to increase, then it's called a positive correlation. Yeah? For example, the more clouds there are and the darker the sky, the greater the probability that it's going to rain. Yeah? As one set of variables increases and the other tends to decrease, then it's called a negative correlation. Simple and easy to measure. A causal relation between two events exists if the occurrence of the first causes the second. The first event is called the cause, the second is called the effect. A correlation between those two variables does not imply causation. On the other hand, if there's a causal relationship between two variables, they must be correlated. And one of the simplest ways of doing that is saying that I know that just about all heroin addicts, rapists, I think that Donald Trump would call them Mexicans. That's not my words, those are his. Not their best people, if you know what I mean. Drank milk when they were young, possibly also rode bicycles, possibly also went to school. Yeah? If you don't know the difference between a correlation and a causal effect, You could then say that let's stop giving them milk, letting them ride bicycles and go to school, because 100% of all heroin addicts probably drank milk when they were babies. But that doesn't mean that everyone who drank milk when they were a baby ended up being a Mexican. Joke for all of the politically correct people here, I am now at this moment being sarcastic and snarky about Donald Trump, so please no bombs of my Facebook, Twitter, or whatever account. Yeah? To actually do anything with learning analytics that is of use to designing courses, informing learners, informing teachers, all of the things that we want to do, we must look for and find causal relationships. And this requires research environments and models that are set up to do this. You need that framework beforehand. Yeah? Otherwise, you get things like this. Okay? I'll give you a case in point. A recent paper presented at the ACM conference on ubiquitous computing attributed a higher grade point average to a drop in stress. Careful reading of the paper, which I did, could also just as easily conclude that getting better test results, which does lead to a higher GPA, leads to lower stress. I don't know about you, but I find the second explanation a lot more plausible than the first, although that wasn't the explanation that the authors used. Here are just a few other spurious correlations. There's a great website that can generate this. It's kind of like an instant jargon generator for spurious correlations. So in other words, we need to, at this moment, for the future, we need a lot more engineers, so let's eat lots more mozzarella cheese. Okay? Is that at the dinner tonight? Related to this is what I call the straw validation. I've used harder words for that, but in a recent article, and the guilty shall also remain unnamed here, the authors tested the validity of their predictive model by giving it to advisors of students to see whether it was providing actionable information and to see if the advisors would be made aware of students needing a call from them and who would not have received the call without the use of the algorithm. This tells us how the model was used by the advisors, but tells us absolutely nothing as to whether the students identified as being at risk were actually at risk. All it said was that if an advisor was told that the students were at risk, if they were more inclined to give them a call. But I think the idea is to first identify the at-risk students. And it was, the validity was measured on whether or not the student got the call. In other words, I made an algorithm to have people call, and they called. Great. Okay. Top science. But as they say, and being in Scotland and one of my favorite poets being Robert Burns, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glij, and lay ons not but grief and pain for promised joy. That's my second favorite. That's Ode to a Mouse. My first is Ode to a Haggis. He wrote this TMS in November 1785. And as he said there, it's, I don't know if you've ever read the poem, but it's about a mouse who did all of these great things for her family of little mice. And then the plowman came, or the plowwoman, and dug up the field, and it went awry. A recent study, I'll give you an example. A recent study by Long and colleagues on student, now I'm naming it because it was a good study. Student motivation in the context of a learning analytics intervention during a summer bridge program. And that's not for building bridges or playing bridge, but that's something in America, I assume, that has to do with children getting extra tuition. Looked at changes in students' academic motivation orientations over the course of one bridge program. and how a learning analytics-based intervention was employed by academic advisors to inform their face-to-face meetings with students. The study was based on a goal orientation paradigm. And for those of you who don't know what it is, you have mastery and performance goals, you have approach and avoidance, and performance is you want to either be better than the rest of the students or not worse than the rest of the students. And if it's mastery, you're either motivated to really master it, or you are motivated to avoid misunderstanding. Yeah, that's those two things. The results of this study show that students' mastery orientation decreased over the course of the bridge program, and indicate that students' exposure to displays of their academic performance in the form of a dashboard that allowed them to compare their activities in the learning module and the grades of that of their peers negatively predicts this change. The findings suggest that student perceptions of their goals and formative performance need to be carefully considered in the learning design of learning analytics interventions, since the resulting tools can affect students' interpretations of their own data as well as their subsequent academic success. In other words, if you tell a mastery-oriented student with this dashboard of yours that they're not doing as well as the other students, or that they're going slower, or they're making not as good use of the learning environment, it tends to decrease their mastery behavior. Whereas I would think the idea of education and learning analytics and the learning systems is to have people learn more deeply. Because deep learning has quite a lot to do with mastery approach, and shallow learning with a performance-based approach. So what you're doing is people who would normally learn in a deep and effective way change their learning behavior to shallow learning so as they are as good, if not better, as their other students. We call them conculega's in Dutch. Learning analytics can also lead to stereotyping, pigeonholing, or profiling. Based on prior results and correct or incorrect learner characteristics, learning labels may be tacked on to learners. Though the intentions are very noble, namely that such learning labels may be intended to help guide the most appropriate instruction for students, leading to sensitivity and respect for each individual, they can instead pigeonhole students into a certain track of courses or profile them as a certain type of learner or even person. And as in the case with credit checkers or racial or ethnic profiling, once such a label has been given, it's extremely difficult to remove it. It's often the case, as with credit checkers, that the learner also has no inkling of the label that has been applied to him or her. Research has shown that in the area of learning analytics, there are instances of learners who become branded due to their previous academic history, who then suffer in their future learning. This is known as labeling bias, where a learner's profile or the label given to her or him biases the instructors and or the institution's perceptions and behaviors towards them. And also the reinforcement of discriminatory attitudes and actions, where analytics reinforces discrimination and actions, discriminatory actions, by profiling learners based upon race, gender, etc. And you also find this in the demographic data, and I often ask them, why do you want to know it? What's in your model, in your framework, which makes race or gender important? And I have no problem with making use of race or gender, but the question is why? And the reason is often to massage data, or if some people follow my Twitter, was it my Twitter feed? In which I talked about extraordinary rendition of data, torturing your data until you get it to say anything you want it to do. So if you send something to JCal and I read it and you write that you used race or gender or other things, I say, what's in your model that makes it important or relevant? And if there's something, it's great, but if it's not, then I really don't need it. As the LACE project reported in their Visions of the Future, in their Horizon report, and I quote, teacher-student relations would be undermined by the use of analytics to the detriment of authentic educational practice. There was a perception that the sole reliance on technology will simply pigeonhole learners, creating stereotypes that undermine the flexibility needed to respond to diverse needs. The result could be greater social exclusion. Now, before proceeding, and you can see the type of music I like, a short intermezzo, and let's look at the complexity of the ecology of learning and education. Learning and education are complex ecologies, and as in all ecologies, they are systems and systemic. Those aren't the same thing. Read Charlie Reigeluth from what he's doing in Indiana. A system means that things are connected in a network. Here you see them for education and learning. You have learners, you have educators, you have technology and media, and they function in an environment, and no one can be seen without the other. Okay. In that respect, the learning ecology is a system, but it's also systemic. And as systemic, any changes or changes made in one part of the system affects not only that part, but all the rest of the system. According to Capra, the activity of systems involves a process known as transaction, the simultaneous and mutually interdependent interaction between multiple components. Systemic properties are destroyed when a system is dissected, either physically or theoretically, into isolated elements. Although we can discern individual parts of any system, the nature of the system as a whole is always different from the mere sum of its parts. In learning analytics, but also in psychology, we have a tendency to be very reductionistic and look at one small part of it. If you read Michael Pollan about food, and some people here in the audience know that I'm a food freak and a cooking freak, he says you can add all of the ingredients together that make up a carrot, but it doesn't make it a carrot. Okay? There's a difference between all of the ingredients in a food and the food itself. In preparing this keynote, this is, if somebody doesn't know this, this is from the frontispiece of Thomas More's Utopia. I've scanned or read hundreds of papers and must confess at the moment that we can basically only speak of potential for learning analytics. In any event, that's my opinion. And if done correctly, learning analytics can lead to 5 utopian futures. I'll try to summarily discuss them, but with the caveat or warning, somebody told me that caveat isn't an English word, that these futures can only be achieved if those who are designing, developing, and researching them keep in mind the dystopias. It's kind of like the difference between a success factor and a failure factor. You can have all the success factors going great, but if you miss the failure factors, what you're doing isn't going to work anyhow. The first is a great quote. I'd call Yogi Berra the Johan Cruyff of American baseball. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. This is the same man who said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Baseball is 90% mental, the other half is physical. If you don't know where you're going, you might wind up someplace else, which is also relevant here. And the future ain't what it used to be. If the 5 causes... Go look up Yogi Berra quotes, there are quite a number of them. If the 5 causes of dystopia are avoided, learning analytics can help us and even allow us to create predictive models composed of relevant variables that may be able to indicate the likelihood of academic success or failure to the learner and or the instructor. I see a lot of research aimed at prediction, either on what those variables are, or they take for granted that certain variables are surefire predictors. Examples of that are IQ, current course performance, online activity within an environment, and or learning materials, number of times a student logs in, number of posts, prior academic history, demographics, etc. The question for me is, are these really the most relevant variables, or are these just the ones we have easy access to and may actually fall into the category of the drunk looking for his or her car keys under a street lamp. For those of you who don't know what EARLY is, the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction, we have a SIG called the SIG 27 Online Measures of Learning Processes. Yesterday, Hector Pereira talked about some of them. And it's dedicated to finding more objective and sophisticated markers in the learning process that can be used as predictors. I'd suggest that many of you, try to come to the winter meeting in beautiful Oulu, Finland. This is where I work a couple of days a month as my visiting professorship there. This is the university, Oulun Yliopisto. Second is Utopia. You can see it here, adapt and personalize. Adaptation is a trait or behavior that helps an animal survive. The problem in learning is that the learner is often not equipped or able to effectively adapt her or his learning and study behavior. And I'll give you two examples. Explaining something to yourself or posing or answering questions while studying works really well, while rereading and highlighting a text don't work at all. But most students do the latter, and most teachers and parents also recommend it. By the way, the green are strategies that have been scientifically proven to work. The gray have not been proven to work. Okay? A second one is variability and distributed practice is much more effective than block studying. For example, task A, B, 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 C, C, C. It takes a little bit longer to do it in the way here, variability of practice, but most research shows that that leads to better transfer and deeper understanding of what you're doing, instead of being, as we call, an ape who's taught a trick in Dutch. I think you call it a knee-jerk reflex. LA, if it looks at, by the way, most students do the latter, as do teachers. We'll drill until they know that one, and then we'll go on to the next one. If you want to learn how to do it properly, read 10 Steps to Complex Design, which I wrote with Jeroen van Merlienboer, which will soon be in the third version. Learning analytics, if it looks at the proper variables, can help guide learners to strategies that are effective and efficient for learning. This adaptivity could also relate to the level of learning. And I'll just give you a small example. This is from Adapt It. I think you know of it, Barbara. This is done with a group that Barbara Wasson is working with. They created an algorithm that sits here within the instructional model. If you look at, for example, what Slava Kalyuga is doing for what tasks your student do next, he not only looks at whether an answer was correct and how much time it took, but also looked at the cognitive load or mental effort needed, with the idea if you needed a lot of mental effort or a lot of time, you probably shouldn't take a very large step, whereas if you did it really quickly with very low mental effort, the step should be greater when you're doing it. So in other words, they're looking at variables which beforehand were seen as being important, because an expert, someone who's better in something, uses much less mental effort to solve a problem properly than someone who's a novice. So if you see very low mental effort and very quick, along with the fact that it was correct, yeah, you have a much better idea of how large the next step should be. Okay, it's just that simple. But how many people here have included online objective measures of mental effort in their learning analytics algorithms that they've set up? I don't think if I asked everyone to raise their hands who did it, there would be very many. But watch out, Dystopia 3, and especially the myth of learning styles, is hiding in wait to make all of our efforts worthless when a learning analytics system or tool tries to help learners decide what to do next by recommending them different learning styles, learning entities based upon their preferences. And as I said earlier, a problem, of course, is stereotyping, pigeonholing, and profiling, and that also needs to be avoided. The third utopia, to recommend, advise, and intervene. I don't think I have to tell you what recommender systems are here. Based upon this, people make decisions, or a system makes decisions as what to recommend. But beware that the proper variables are used, and not just the variables that are easiest to find. And if we look at the evolution of it, we're kind of getting somewhere near the right and the larger balls. But if I look at the models that people are using, I'm kind of finding people making use of the item hierarchy, attribute-based recommendations, collaborative filtering, and those types of things. This is a classification that Hendrik came up with, which shows you all of the different things that you might want to think about while you're setting up a recommender system. Almost all of the systems that are shown and are done rely heavily on providing real-time feedback to the learner. And these are in service of making learning more effective, efficient, and or enjoyable. Those who know Hattie know why the zone of desired effects is at 0.4. I won't go into it, but feedback is just about the most important thing for getting a large effect. But learning analytics often uses very limited subset of the types of feedback available. Here are a few others. What's learned? It's a summative, the amount, the type, and the depth. What is learned informative? The feedback on the process. That can be corrective, that can be directive, that can be epistemic. How it's being learned? Strengthening of disabling behaviors. Detecting and alleviating undesirable behaviors when it's given, before, during, or after. Those are all different ways of giving feedback. And I find very few of them used. If you did a meta-study, very few of those are used. They're often very much corrective or directive, just-in-time feedback, which are often not the best for deep learning. And the fifth utopia is that we might get better learning environments, because it gives us things to help improve our courses, gives good feedback to staff, helps for grouping students. You have to think in your model, how do you want to group students? Yeah? Your planning and scheduling, all of those types of things. But I had an anecdote, but I want to say the information uncovered through good learning analytics can reveal activities and patterns of student behavior to learners or intermediaries in the learning process that are otherwise opaque. That's on this Eric Duval Day, that's a quote from Eric. We've lost someone incredibly important to our field, but let's not dwell on that. There are some nice futures. I'll give you an example for me close to home, and that's SLAM, which is an acronym, an absurd acronym, for Strategic Regulation of Learning through Learning Analytics and Mobile Clouds of Individual or Collaborative Learning Success. But as Hector told us yesterday, we're making use of all different types of physiological data and targeted use of learning analytics to analyze, interpret, and visualize what we hope are relevant self-regulated learning data, not learning data, self-regulated learning data of individuals and groups of learners. But there are also many worst-case scenarios, as a tweeter recently posted. Those in Dutch will appreciate the name of the tweeter. The problem with worst-case scenarios is that they actually occur. It's not a mere fancy. Face-to-face, privately, I'll tell you what this means. And remember, learning isn't a means to an end. It's an end in itself. And if I may add, the opposite sometimes looks true in learning analytics. Learning analytics is, in my opinion, nothing more than a tool to get us somewhere. It's not the place where we want to be. Two pieces of advertising, and then I'm done. First, please go to the newest issue of JCAL, Journal of Computer Assisted Learning. It's a special issue on learning analytics in massively multi-user virtual environments and courses. And it's available online, and 300 LAK'16 attendees can freely access it with the code that's here. Be quick, because this is being broadcasted. And the second, if you want to avoid the many myths, let me recommend our book, Urban Myths About Learning and Education. If you hate me, write me an email. If you have any other questions, please don't troll me on Twitter. But that's the ways you can get to me, follow me, and I also have some blog sites, both in English and Dutch, that you can look at. That's it. Thank you very much.